Hello and good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on when you're hearing this. I'm Katie Tyler and welcome to the Sociology Staffroom. So today we've got Peter Covington with us, and you're here to talk to us about particularly the 10-mark question. So first of all, hello and thank you for your time.
No problem at all. Nice to meet you.
Oh, thank you, Peter. I appreciate there might be a little bit of a delay there, so hopefully we'll be good with the sound. But yeah, definitely. So first of all, 10 markers. We know about the 10 markers. They appear on every paper, particularly an issue suggesting that it's a concern. It might not be for students and staff, but obviously the option paper has obviously a significant amount of the 10 markers on there. I know that, say, for some of the students, and there's sort of a concern around the 10 markers, particularly the one with the item, but yeah, the 10 markers, I think the students do, well, maybe it's just my sort of own experience and stuff, but why do you think some students might find, I'm going sort of launching into the 10 markers because of assumption the audience knows what we're talking about in regards to 10 markers with them teaching sociology, but why do you think some of the students might find, in your experience, 10 markers a challenge?
I think there are a number of issues, really. I think, first of all, they just don't write enough. So often, well, it's obviously 15 minutes, so they need to be writing at least a side of A4, probably a bit more than that. So I often see kind of much less than that. And, obviously they're thinking they're going to get really good marks with that. And they can do if they're really precise, but they need to be really precise, very analytical, and need to use lots of studies. And often that's just not there. So I think that's the first challenge, just making sure you do write enough. I think the other thing is that you just need to be aware of the two different skills that the 10 markers are asking for. And the other thing is to make it as easy for the examiner as possible to just spot what is going to be rewarded, really. And often that just doesn't happen.
Yeah, so like obviously for us as teachers, because obviously the audience will be here, sort of teachers, some of us experienced teachers, some people new to teaching, some people that are non-specialists. So it's that magic question students always ask us, how much should I be writing for that question? But I suppose it's not just the question of how much, although you obviously said that students don't write enough, but making sure they analyse enough and making sure they are precise and concise as well. And I think that's where the students, particularly my own experience, get unstuck a little bit on that. So I want to sort of delve into that a little bit, because obviously I should have said that you're an experienced teacher for many years within sociology, both at A level and at GCSE. And it's always just good to share good practice with people that have been in the field for a significant amount of time, let's just say, a significant amount of time, without aging you there, Peter.
30 years, I
But
think, is important that we talk about.
yeah, definitely. So, I mean, what is we talked about one without the item first, because that seems a little bit more sort of less complex maybe for some of our students. How do we sort of, as professionals, help to support our students with answering this question then? What would your recommendations be?
Well, my recommendation would be just to go, first, my first point is literally you spell it out for the examiner, what points and what IDs. You just need to make sure that you make it very clear what ID you're coming up with or what point you're coming up with. And then obviously what you're doing is you're analysing that particular point, explaining it, using as many writers and concepts and theory as possible. And my recommendation, although the exam boards say you don't need to evaluate, I really don't think it does any harm just to have a small gobbet of evaluation at the end of each of the paragraphs concerned. And it should literally just be 2 paragraphs. Paragraph 1 with your first point you're going to make, and paragraph 2. Done, really.
Yeah, so sort of almost like mini essays, aren't they? Because I was talking to Kate Flatley about this right at the beginning, sort of in the summer, really, when we've sort of launched the podcast. And it always makes sense sort of to teach 10 markers first, because it's almost like they are the setup for your 30 markers and your 20 markers, because the paragraphs are really what you're looking at. Is, like you said, you want to make the ID, you want to explain that, you want to apply concepts, names, and then potentially analysis, obviously, and evaluation, which is what you've just said. And obviously all within sort of 15 minutes, which I suppose is a skill has to be developed, because obviously at greater depth, they've got to write more for the 20 and 30 marker. What are, other than sort of the sort of not right enough, not enough analysis, is there any other particular pitfalls with the one without the item for students?
Yeah, and I think often they don't look at the question, and when it says experiences of childhood, you've got to explain how the children feel about both adults working. So I mean, one of the tips we were given was how does it make the children feel? And I feel feels quite a nice word, because you think about how they do feel about it. So very look at the wording, make sure that you're using that similar wording when you're responding in your example.
Because often I've noticed with just the way examples generally are going, with whatever example schools are working with, and across subjects actually, because I was talking to other students and teachers from other subjects, and there is that demand now to sort of assess skills a lot more rather than just knowledge, which obviously makes sense because it's not a memory game at particularly A level. That they're sort of looking at applying across two sort of areas of the specification on that topic. So, for example, if it's childhood, it's experiences of childhood with changes in family size or something like that. So, again, those people that might not be experienced that, what are your sort of tricks in order to do that in your own teaching practice?
I think the first thing to say is for teachers in general to get as many exemplars as possible. Every year get a selection of kind of A star or a C or a B candidate, and just see what they're writing and show the students. And I think I always say to my students, I don't want you to replicate what's been written here. It's a guide for you as to what you need to be doing, seeing the structure, seeing the kind of wording that's needed, seeing the evaluation, and so on. So kids, they could just know roughly what they need to be doing. And I think that makes it so much easier for students when they've got a template that they can be using really to guide their answers. So that's a really strong recommendation. I think the other thing to say is also, use as many examples as possible. And then you're getting your application marks in as well.
Yeah, so getting sort of examples of concepts, real life examples, and putting that across. Yeah, I mean, I know that. I spoke to Duncan, which would be one of the sort of previous podcasts about sort of revision and looking at that and thinking about. He also echoed the importance of looking at exam questions and doing exam questions and looking at either planning them, doing them, because ultimately, though there's that sort of debate, should we teach for the exam, should we not to teach for the exam, ultimately they are going to have an exam, and that's a really good way of revising and playing around with sort of bits of the specification and sort of planning responses to that, so the students feel quite familiar with that. And another way, like you've just said, is using exemplars, which are really important because students can do quite a lot with them, can't they? I was just thinking about that today. I know myself, I've just printed off looking at exemplars, and I'm sort of ex-students basically, and got them sort of obviously take all the names off and all that sort of stuff and rewrite them and jazz them up, and getting students to think about grading them as well. So it's not just them writing them, it's getting them used to probably the mark scheme as well. With regards to the item, this one's the one that I think is the one that sort of could, for some, be a bit of a car crash, and it's sort of a challenging question. So my sort of question to that is, again, what is the challenge with the 10 mark with the item? What are the pitfalls? And how can we overcome them?
Well, I think the obvious pitfall is that they don't find the hook. And if they don't find the hook, the maximum mark they're going to get is 3. So it is absolutely essential that you make the hook as obvious to the examiner as possible. And that probably just means, literally quoting what the hook is, and doing that at the very start of the paragraph. And then obviously from that point onwards, you analyse, obviously use writers, evaluate, and so on. I find it really frustrating if I'm looking right the way through, a side of A4, and I can't obviously see which hooks they're using. And that just makes it more difficult for me to mark. And, when it's down to it, you want your examiner to kind of see it straight away, and want to reward as many marks as possible immediately, as it were. So there's the first idea, that you make the 2 hooks very straightforward, put them in the front, literally the first paragraph the first sentence of that paragraph, it's there so the examiner can see it straight away, and you do the same for the second hook as well.
So again, that could be quite an easy starter activity, couldn't it, for our students? Is sort of getting them to make items. I know that Duncan said this already, that we could get either students to make up items to make our life a little bit easier as they get more confident, or pulling off items off, you know, the
well, you just
yeah,
don't you? You just say, what I do is I'll just say to the students, what are the 2 or 3 hooks there? And they get so used to kind of finding them. And I definitely think that over since 2017, they've made it easier for us to find, or for students to find the hook. I think to start off with, they were kind of working out whether students would find them easily, and it was obvious by 2018 they weren't, and from that point onwards I think it just got easier. So I think that there really shouldn't be a problem with finding the hooks, certainly with more modern papers, 21, 22, much more easy to find them. But just signal them, and try not to use synonyms. Don't try to reword it. Use the words there to make it as obvious for the examiner as possible. Because as I said, examiners want their life to be as easy as possible. Go, oh, there we are, underline the hook, and then obviously look for writers, how it's applied to the question, etc., etc.
So pretty much the same format as the 10 marker, but applying it to the hook, which is essential. So it's one similar to the 10 markers without the item in its format to a point, although it requires more sort of analysis in that, and also
definitely
an evaluation, yeah, and also application to that item. That's the key, because I think, yes, sometimes I suppose the question's there and the students want to answer the question and almost ignore the item, sort of like you see the question, and sometimes the question's implicitly answering the item, but it's not explicit, so that's sort of accidental rather than anything. So you would recommend, do you get your students to signpost them then? Is that what you get them to do?
Yeah, absolutely.
Actually, like physically, yeah. Would you get them to underline it, like literally underline it, quote it?
Well, the first thing you do is to say to your students, read it. I mean, I think it's so generic that it'd be almost impossible not to use. I mean, no examiner is going to go, well, they didn't use one part of the item, I'm going to give it 7 rather than 10. It doesn't work like that. So certainly they need to read it. And obviously there's clues there from the item itself. So use the item, obviously. Scribble on it, use highlighters or whatever. Certainly apply the knowledge that's sitting right in front of them, that's going to assist them with the answering the question, really.
And how do you get the students to revise for it, other than sort of just looking at the items? Is there any other techniques that you use in order to help the students revise these 10 markers? Because they are such a feature of all papers, paper 1, 2 and 3.
Well, I'm a big one for just looking at the trends, what's come up, what's due to come up, what wording they use. And you can literally just go through and spot, what that they tend to use experience, or something like that, experience of childhood or something like that, and just see what's come up and what's likely to come up as well. So I'm very keen on question spotting. I think it works very well. And obviously you've got to caveat that and say, look, we're not soothsayers, we don't know what the exam board are going to be exactly writing, but you can certainly assist them to think about what questions have come up, what the wording is, and for them to kind of revise accordingly, really. The same thing applies to essays.
And I suppose the key is same happens. Yeah, as I say, the key message for me, correct me if I'm wrong, is practice, practice, practice. Is that right? Is that what you're sort of saying, or is it an exposure, I suppose, to those sort of questions?
The only thing I do in class, I do assessments in class and class only. I think in a day modern age where they can just go on the computer, just put the question in and churn it out, there is no point doing assessment. 10 markers or 30 markers outside the classroom, it's just a waste of time. So what I do is I prepare them for that. I'll go through what they need to be putting. I'll show them an exemplar. We'll go through the mark scheme and go, well, are you sure you know all these concepts? Ask them, perhaps test them as what those concepts are. Even for a test essay or a 10 marker, what I do is use starters to guide them and make sure that they know all the concepts, all the writers they need to be using, and appropriate examples as well. So I think that's key as well. I think the last thing to make a comment about is, I'm very fortunate that I'm a one-person department. Is that fortunate or not? I'm not sure actually. I think in many ways it is fortunate because you can make the links from family to crime and deviance, from media to crime and deviance, globalization, for example. And I think that really, really helps if you are a one-person department. But even if you're not, I think you can sit together and make sure that you do kind of plan for those synoptic links to be made. And I think that's particularly true of, these 10 markers where it might talk about migration and family and, just there's so many synoptic links to be made, really.
Some interesting points I'd like to sort of pick with you very sort of briefly. I noticed you sort of said that controversially or not controversially, depending what side of the fence you sit on, that you only do exam questions in lesson time. How then? I mean, this is not the question that I'm trying. I'm not playing devil's advocate
Like,
solely on this question, although there's an element of that. How do you get through content? How do you balance that then? How do you balance getting through content as well as devoting exam time in lesson time?
I think there's nothing more important than practicing exam questions. So I think it's just experience, isn't it? And I know that if I go the same pace as I usually do, I'll finish a month early, and that's the way it goes. Sometimes you have to rush things towards the end a bit, but often they're like bits where there's kind of overlap. So, for example, with crime and deviance, you do mods and rockers, but you'll also do that when you do media as well. So you can cut bits out as well. So, I mean, I think it's about being savvy with your time, making sure you're not overspending time on. I mean, the reality is, I mean, what was I doing today? I was doing, Matza, for example, and that's like 2 or 3 lines in a question on subculture theory. So you need to be aware that you need to cover it, but equally that you're not going to be spending 2 weeks on it because it is just a small part of subcultural theory, and just getting used to what you kind of need to do to make sure you do finish the content. And I think that's is interesting. Obviously, I'm not doing exams for what's 2020 2021 teachers. They've got to think about, well, actually you need to make sure you do finish the spec. And of course, this year we're in the situation where we're not going to be told any advanced information. But again, I think that's where experience comes down to, well, what questions do you think is going to come up? Look for the trends, both for 10 markers and for 30 markers, and indeed for 4 to 6 markers as well. So you can see the patterns and what's likely to come up.
Okay, so sort of a combination of things is a little bit of experience, a little bit of knowing the examples, and your specification, obviously, which goes without saying. What about people that would say, well, what about engagement? If students are doing exam questions consistently as sort of within lesson time, how do you keep them motivated, particularly if it's sort of sandwiched at are you thinking do you do it, obviously I assume you do it throughout the year, or sort of load it a little bit more towards the end? How does that look for you when you're putting the exam questions in?
When you finish your topic area, you do an assessment. Again, it's not just about doing an assessment. What I do is literally I give them directed feedback time where they look through their scripts. They see what they could have put in the introduction, what could have gone in paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the concepts, all the writers, all the evaluation, and I get them to add it into their script. So I think engagements in terms of, well, when it comes down to it, in school assessment is practice, and I want them to peak not when they're doing the assessment in class, but when they're doing it in the exam, and that's really what you're trying to do. And I find they do peak then, so that's really the way to do it, isn't it? I think they just feel confident that I always say to my students that 38%, they reckon 38% of the mark is just knowing what you've got to do. So if you're telling the kids exactly what they need to do, they're part of the way there, aren't they?
Of course, yeah, and obviously it's an application of the skill within the exam setting as well. Any sort of final tips? Because obviously, I appreciate, like you said, you're a one-person department, I suppose, a one-person subject, and obviously there's strengths and weaknesses with that. We've spoken up with other guests that we've had on, and obviously your experience within your setting is relative to the context that you're in, and it's great to share good practice. So is there any sort of other final words of wisdom from yourself, Peter, that you think that might, some of us may pick up on or think about, consider?
I think the few things are essential. And sorry, my doorbell's just gone now.
Don't worry, that's just
Uh,
life. That's just life.
it is just life. The cat's just gone crazy as well. I think my wife will get it in a second. Anyway. And you know, I can't stress how important it is for students to make sure they write legibly. And I think if you're spotting students who, when they're doing test essays, and you're going, I can't read this, you need to be thinking about making sure they type it out instead. And
And given enough
I
plenty
can't.
of time, I assume, for that whole
Yeah,
process to be sorted out within school. Yeah.
yeah, no one tells you these things, but when you
Mm.
struggling with the script, you need to be going right. You go to your you go to the SEN department and say, look, I can't read this person's writing. We need to make sure if that's across the board, make sure that they're typing out their scripts, and I think that makes a huge difference as well. And of course, they do that in test essays, whether it's a 10 marker, whether it's a 30 marker. But I think make sure they write in a dark pen, a black pen, so the examiner can read what's on the screen there, because it's not easy.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, what I think is useful advice that you just said is really sort of sensible advice. Is um, I think sometimes as teachers we think, oh well, the student's gone through the school and they haven't been given any sort of considerations from sending these through the school for whatever reason, and then when it comes to exam mark time, whether that's GCSE or A level, because it hasn't been picked up previously, people think, oh well, I don't need to pick it up now because surely it would have been picked up in the past. But actually, the reality is, well, students haven't really done exams before like this, so it might be the first time they encounter it at GCSE, or for some reason GCSE the exams look maybe a little bit shorter on the papers, and then it's more of a thing when it comes to A levels where the essays are longer. And yeah, I totally echo that if you've got any inkling with a student that you feel that may need a typewriter or extra time, or typewriter, gosh, I'm saying my age, I mean, word processor.
I've got a great story about that. My first school, very posh school in East London. Literally, this student, he'd done brilliantly right the way through the course, and he sat exam and he got like a D, and he did a star right the way through the whole of the course. And he then told me that he was dyslexic. I didn't know that, and of course, he didn't have the extra time at GCSE, so he just assumed he wouldn't get extra time at A level. And what happened was we proved that you've got dyslexia, whatever. Again, you need to make sure you get the SEN department to side there to do that. Redid the paper and he got an A grade, so from a D. So I think you can't stress the importance of, knowing your kids and just knowing, knowing them and what kind of issues they have. And if you don't know issues, you're going to find your kids underachieving, and they might have to resit the paper like he did. So I think it's just knowing the kids and making sure you give your students every best possible chance of doing really well in the exam.
Oh, thank you. That's such sensible advice, because I think sometimes there's a sort of chain of reactions to that, isn't it? It's getting all that evidence in place as well. So there's a cut-off date, which I can't remember the date is for different schools or whatever. So making sure that information is there. So thank you for that. That's really sensible advice. And thank you again for sharing your time and your ideas for teaching those 10 markers. And like you said, lots of practice makes perfect, and exposure to lots of different questions is a great idea. So thank you again. Have a lovely
No,
evening, and
I will.
I hope your cat's okay.
Oh, she's back in a box now, so we're fine.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, well, have a lovely evening, and thank you.
Very much. Bye
Good
bye.
evening. Thank you. Bye bye.